Alright everyone, so at this point I feel like Loki is now my favorite non-Straw Hat character in One Piece. Loki may have, with this chapter, just supplanted Wiper as my new favorite side character in the entire story. And that might be recency bias, but Loki has been a remarkably likable character from his very introduction, and the more and more that we've seen of him, from his birth to his upbringing, and most importantly to this climactic scene where he had to kill his own father and then take the fall for it. I think all of that together packages him as a really, really compelling character. But before we really dive into all of that, let's just take this chapter from the top. So to begin with, we have the fallout from Harold's death. And look, with Harold, he's never going to be a character where I'm really going to remember his death scene as something very heartbreaking and emotionally gut-wrenching, whereas I'm very used to, throughout One Piece, getting flashbacks like that where we see an iconic character go out in a way that really, really sticks with you in your memory and in your feelings. That's just not going to be the case with Harold. I think that's very interesting because this is a first for Oda. This is the first time he wrote a flashback, which I'm now going to view as the Rocks and Harold flashback, where the two core flashback characters are both nobly written characters. They're both treated as morally good, and instead are made to go out in a very undignified manner, both as pawns of God, and both of them begging for somebody to put them out of their misery. And just as out of story, we're not going to really remember their deaths as something very, very emotionally touching, in story, that's kind of the case as well, where with both Rocks and Harold, you have the people who saw their death basically sort of agreeing to just never speak of this because what they saw is just so uncomfortable. Loki, Gaban, Shanks, they're basically like, yeah, we can never let anybody know what happened here in the castle. Just as Roger and Garp kind of silently agree that, yeah, we're not going to tell people how Rocks went out. And in general, the remnants of the Rocks pirates don't like to talk about Rocks' final moments that they saw of him. So it's really interesting that this late in the game, Oda is still changing things up and deliberately writing characters who go out in a manner that is actually much more muddy and much more uncomfortable than we're used to in the story of One Piece. And I talked about this more in depth in my previous video, Rocks and Harold, A Tale of War and Peace, but this chapter really does sort of cement the ideas that I was talking about in that video, if you want to go check that out for a deeper analysis on what Oda was trying to do with this entire flashback. But the flashback does wrap up here, and with that I want to congratulate Justin Holland for winning this week's chapter predictions by correctly predicting that the flashback would end and that we would be seeing Luffy's reaction to the end of the chapter. Make sure to tune into Friday streams every break week to get in on the chapter predictions competitions. Now, it is of course surprising to me, and I'm sure a lot of people, that the flashback ended right here, because I think a lot of us expected to see a little bit more of Loki's story, because we know that it doesn't end here. We know that there's a few things that come around the corner, such as Loki and Lola's romance. What happened to that? And Loki going around rampaging at sea, and Loki's encounter with Shanks that I think a lot of people were really looking forward to. And then finally Loki being thrown back in jail here at Elbaf. So there is a chunk left of Loki's story that we still need to find out, really like 14 years of his story that we don't really get to see. But I like that because I think that means that there's still more meat on the bone here and that Oda is going to give us more of that, hopefully by the end of Elbaf. Maybe we have to wait for Shanks' own backstory, but I do like that we're ending at a good climactic point that takes us right back into the swing of things with everything going on here at Elbaf. I think if the flashback had dragged on too much, then it would lose a little bit of momentum, but ending it right here keeps things squarely focused, which is, okay, we just saw how terrible Imu is, Loki's motivations for wanting to defeat Imu, and that brings us right back to the current story where, what do you know, Imu is on this island of Elbaf, and now we have a charged up, angry Loki ready to go up and fight him, and that is absolutely perfect narrative momentum. Now, as for the scene in general where the flashback wraps up, I like the setup that we seem to get for Shanks here, in that we get to see Shanks having to contend with his own past, and I like that a lot because the Shanks that we see today is a sort of wise and really mature figure. But it wasn't always like that. He is human at the core of it, and he has his own internal struggles, his own sort of traumas that he has to grapple with, even if he puts out this very composed and sage-like front for everybody else. And what's really interesting is the Shanks that we see sort of having a breakdown right here is actually only a couple years removed from the Shanks that we see in chapter 1 of the story. And that guy seemed like the most wise, calm, level-headed, sort of put-together character ever. But this is a nice reminder that under the surface, Shanks also had a lot going on, even all the way back in chapter 1 himself. He was never just this perfect character who had it all figured out. But now let's talk about the meat of it, which is Loki. Before we get into Loki's own character writing here, What I really like is his starting line, which is, I guess you can love your country too much. This is really important because this has been something that's been established throughout One Piece, which is that the mark of a really great king is loving your country. That's a big theme in the Alabasta arc. That's what Cobra talks about, that's what Vivi talks about. The hallmark of a great leader, of a great ruler, is just loving your country. That's why Vivi can't go sail with the Straw Hats. It's a line that's reiterated frequently throughout Alabasta. And we see it among other great kings in the story. Dalton loves Drum Kingdom. King Riku loves the nation of Dressrosa, and that's why it pains him so much to see what it's become. But finally in Elbaf, we're kind of getting the flip side of it, which is you have this King Harold who goes too far. In his deep, deep love for the country and his goals of trying to fix it and turn it into something that he views as more pure, he actually goes too far and takes it away from a lot of the values that actually were important to the country as well. And I think it's interesting that Imu himself is the one who also goes on to reflect on these ideas. Imu kind of mocking the fact that Harold is the type of character that is born to be a warrior. He should be a warrior. His whole nation is one of warriors, and yet Harold, in his love for his country, went so far in neutering them. What an aberration, what a mistake. And with this whole Harold incident, Imu kind of just writes off the whole nation of Elbaf as like, well, at their core, they're just these barbarians that, you know what, we don't even want them anyway. Which is very interesting because actually the Elbaf arc in the modern day starts with the Gods Knights actually trying to recruit Loki to their cause. And Imu once said that, no, we're never going to make an ancient giant or a giant of Elbaf a Gods Knight again. So this suggests that there was some sort of change in thinking, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's because the final war is coming around the corner, and so Imu is having to make some compromises here and there because he's just like, okay, we need some strong forces because Somers is not going to cut it. I do need some better Gods Knights, so let me break that rule I kind of made after the whole Herald incident, and let me invite Loki again to join the Gods Knights, but Loki of course says no. The other two big things we learn from Imu here is that one, the covenants that Imu makes with his subordinates where he grants them powers do in fact come at some sort of a cost to him, and I think personally, I'm going to put this out in a theory later, I do believe that these may be some of the keys to ultimately defeating Imu. It also explains why Imu doesn't go around just making as many subordinates as possible through his magic. Imu confirms that Elbaf is of the D, and that goes to one of my other theories, which is that I believe that in general the D tribe are just lineages descended from those who once served alongside Joy Boy. So again, we kind of get some answers here, but that lead to more questions, as is classic One Piece style. But finally, for real, let's talk about Loki and this beautiful scene of him sitting there with Jarl, Gaban, and Shanks, and all of these other giants of Elbaf sitting around listening to him. I just love the dialogue from Loki here. He happily takes the blame for his father's death upon himself because he's like, that's just what I've been doing my whole life. Everybody always blames me for these things. That's just what I'm gonna shoulder because it's the right thing to do. And what's really cool to me is that Loki's recognizing that this is the right thing to do and the right way to honor his father's ideals, even though he doesn't agree with his father's ideals. I think that's really interesting because lots of times you get, characters like Hiriluk passing on a will to Chopper, where it's the same sort of ideology being passed on from parent to child. But with Loki, he didn't agree with what his father was doing. He thinks that Elbaf is a place of war and it should be a place of war, but he still wants to honor his father's legacy anyway. And if his father felt like that is what is right for Elbaf, then Loki's like, you know what, I will treat that as correct as well. Because he could step up and become the king. That is offered to him, that is what should happen theoretically right here. But Loki says, even if I were to become king, I know myself. I know my own ways. They are not aligned with what Harold would have wanted, which is a peaceful Elbaf. Loki knows that at his core, he is a warrior. He is a fighter. That cannot change. And so he would not be able to continue to build Elbaf in the direction that Harold would have wanted. And so Loki's really honoring his father's legacy, doubly so by doing all of this. Because it's not just trying to protect his father's image and reputation, Loki also wants to uphold everything that his father built by sacrificing his own reputation completely, by sacrificing his right to the throne. He wants to preserve everything about Harold, both his father's reputation and legacy, and what his father has built, and the future of Elbaf that he has been pushing towards. So Loki's like, the thing that I know is war, so the way I'm going to solve this whole situation is go to war with Imu. I don't care what the Giants of Elbaf think of me. They've always thought these things about me. Let them think that. I would rather they think well of my father instead and keep building on what he built. I think that's beautiful. And with that, Loki sets off to go fight Imu. I would love to know why Shanks decides that he needs to stop him in this endeavor or what goes on there. But as we know with One Piece, lots of times the things that we hear about a story in advance turn out to be missing a ton of context. As is the case with, when we heard that Loki killed his father. Now we have all the context and now everything makes sense. And so now finally the chapter ends with, Hadruden forgiving Loki. I don't really care about Hadruden, so, take that as you will. And the cool thing is that it's time to fight. So, really important thing to note for Loki here is that Loki is still severely nerfed. I think it is so insanely interesting that Oda decided that he needed to nerf Loki for his big debut in battle in the modern day arc of Elbaf. I think it's likely that even after this whole flashback, people will still be underestimating Loki to some degree, even though he just went toe to toe with Herald, who characters are openly acknowledging basically would have been a huge problem for the entire world if he got out. And this is Herald, who was fighting evenly with Rox before, who's been amped by Emu, who basically became this unstoppable, forever regenerating force. Loki was going perfectly even with him, even before Herald came back to his senses and allowed Loki to get the finishing blow. So Loki is insanely strong. And even if people might be skeptical, I do think that the biggest indicator that Loki might just be as strong as he seems on paper is the fact that Oda decided that I need to weaken this character for him to slot into the story of Elbaf. Oda has never done that with a significant side character before. Oda was never like, I need to nerf Yamato before the arc starts so she's injured. Oda was never like, I need to nerf Viper before the arc starts so that he's injured. Loki is the first character that Oda's like, this guy's too strong. He's too strong. I need him severely injured. He's not going to be back at full health for like a month. And now I can slot him in next to Luffy and the Straughts and everything, and it won't be out of place. And even with that, the first thing that Loki does is take out this monster that is literally larger than mountain ranges. Like, no exaggeration whatsoever. This monster towers over mountain ranges. This is like a Zunisha-sized creature, practically. And it looks like Loki takes it out with one strike, and the big revealing thing about this strike is that it establishes that Loki doesn't just have lightning powers with Ragnar. It appears that Ragnar also has ice powers, which is just insane, because at that point, whatever this squirtle fruit is, it's arguably the strongest fruit in existence outside of maybe the Nika fruit, Guragur no Mi, and Emu's fruit. But outside of that, the absurd package of abilities that it grants, on the scale that it grants, which is lightning far greater than Enel's lightning, and ice on a scale that seems reasonably comparable to Aokiji, this fruit is absolutely absurd, whatever this fruit is, and we haven't even gotten to Loki's own fruit, which is even more hyped up than the hammer itself. So really excited to see everything Loki can do, but we're not even gonna get to see Loki at his best in this arc, because Oda nerfed him on top of everything else. And finally, we have the voice of the people, my top tier of patrons. So Justin Holland said that Luffy fully listening to Loki's story is a rare sight. Plus, willingness to watch Loki fight gives me hope for some character development. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Luffy's willingness to watch Loki fight indicates character development. Luffy often gets excited by those sort of things, but Luffy actually sitting still and listening to Loki's whole story is somewhat of a rarity for Luffy. I think the last time that I remember Luffy doing that was when Luffy listened to Inuarashi recounting the story of the Scabbards and the Odin flashback in Act 1 of Wano. I don't read too much into that, other than sometimes it's just important for Luffy to actually know the details of the arc, so sometimes Oda decides that that's important, sometimes he doesn't. But I do like that it at least feels out of respect in this case, like Luffy respects Loki, so he does want to hear the story from Loki's perspective. So with all that being said, I give this chapter a 9 out of 10, and with that, I will talk to you all later.